In this video, I'm going to take you through the download and installation process of Home Assistant. Make sure you stick around, and if you like what you see, make sure you hit subscribe below and keep an eye out for more videos. Hi, I'm Will from Surridge Tech, and today we're going to be having a look at the different ways of downloading Home Assistant, the different options available, and then we'll download it and install it on a Raspberry Pi. This video is going to form part of a series going from rookie to pro, covering everything you need to know about Home Assistant, so keep an eye out for those videos when they're released. So let's get going. Now there are many ways of installing Home Assistant. You can use a Raspberry Pi, an Intel NUC, use a virtual machine, or install it on Docker or Linux. But before we look into the different ways, we need to know the different types of Home Assistant. There are two types of Home Assistant. You either have Home Assistant Core and Home Assistant Supervised. Home Assistant Core is kind of the core tools. It's everything you need to run Home Assistant and to automate things and that kind of thing. It's very stripped back, whereas Supervised is kind of the complete all-in-one package. It has Core on the inside, but then it has a pretty layer on the outside, whether that's an easy installation or the ability to use an add-on store or anything like that. If you're watching this video, then I'd highly recommend you use Supervised as your installation type, because it's got all the nice things, it's much easier to use really. Now Supervised is sometimes called Home Assistant Supervised, it's sometimes just called Home Assistant, or it's sometimes called Home Assistant OS, depending on your installation method. So starting at the bottom of the list, we have the Linux installation. You can either install on Linux using the Core or the Supervised version, but Home Assistant recommends that you are very familiar with the operating system. I think this is going to be quite complicated, so I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you're watching this beginner's video. Next up, we have Docker. Now on Docker, you can only install Home Assistant Core, not Supervised. Obviously, this is possible, but you do require a knowledge of Docker, which I don't have. You're also going to lose out on the supervised features, such as the add-on store. So unless you already have Docker up and running, you know how to use it, and you need your Home Assistant to be on the same Docker device in a Docker container, then I wouldn't recommend doing this. And lastly, we have the recommended installation methods of Home Assistant OS. Now you can either install it on a Raspberry Pi, an Intel NUC, or a virtual machine. Obviously the setup process for a virtual machine is going to be slightly different because you're going to have to build the virtual machine in the software you're using, that software being something like VirtualBox, and make sure it's got the right network capabilities and hardware capabilities through your virtual machine. But beyond that, it's not that complicated. I'm going to run you through the installation on a Raspberry Pi. Now if you're here, I would highly recommend using this installation method. It works amazingly. You may choose later on down the line to upgrade to a virtual machine or a NUC if you want a bit more power, but I currently run on a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus and I don't really have any issues with that, and I've got quite a few devices integrated. It's by far the simplest way of downloading, installing and managing Home Assistant. And also you've got the added benefit of it being a cheap standalone device. So if it all goes wrong, you can just unplug it and not worry about anything else and just plug it back in again and try again. Or if it goes really, really wrong, you can just reflash the SD card. Obviously these are kind of possible with other versions or options, but it's much easier with Raspberry Pi. And if you blow it up, then it's only 30 quid. You shouldn't blow it up. That would be bad if you blow it up. Even I haven't blown it up. So for this installation, you're going to need a Raspberry Pi, a suitable power supply, and a micro SD card. I'm using a 64 gig micro SD card, but you can get away with 32 gig, or even smaller if you're not too worried about logs or aren't planning on saving photos or videos to your Home Assistant. Now to get started, obviously, we're going to head to the Home Assistant website. In here, we click Getting Started. We click on the devices, and we can see that my device, the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, is listed here. So we just click on that and that will download the correct image. Obviously, if you're using a different Pi or a NUC or a different device, then download the correct image here. Once downloaded, we're going to need to flash it. So we need to put the SD card into our computer and run a little bit of software called Etcher. I've left a link to it below. In here, you select the image that you've just downloaded, the SD card, and click Flash. And that will write the Home Assistant image onto your SD card, ready for booting. Once the flash is finished, you put the SD card into your Pi, you plug your Pi into your router using an Ethernet cable, and you power it on. After a little while, you should be able to navigate to homeassistant.local:8123, and you should be presented with this window here, saying it's pending. During this time, it will be installing the latest version of Home Assistant and kind of configuring itself ready to boot. So don't worry if this window hasn't appeared quite yet, just give it a little bit of time. And don't worry if this window stays on for more than 20 minutes. Obviously, if it takes too long, then I'd try starting again just in case you've corrupted something somewhere along the line. But it may take a bit longer than 20 minutes, especially depending on your network speeds. After we've waited that bit of time, then we should be displayed with a new screen asking us to create a user account. We add our username and password, and then we can click Next, and we can select our home location and add some basic units that we want Home Assistant to run with. Don't worry, you can change all this later if you want. When we click Next, we're displayed with some integrations. Don't worry if you don't have any integrations here. These will pop up if Home Assistant has automatically discovered them. Some devices will be discovered automatically, others won't necessarily be discovered automatically, so don't panic. I'm not going to configure them here, but you could click on them and configure them here if you wanted to. Once we click Next, we're into Home Assistant. And that's all there is to it. Home Assistant fully downloaded and installed and ready to integrate. Make sure you keep an eye out for my next video where I'll do a walkthrough of the Home Assistant interface and integrate some basic devices. So there we go, Home Assistant up and running on a Raspberry Pi. Make sure you hit that subscribe button below and click the bell icon to find out more about my smart tech and how you can build yourself the ultimate smart home.